which claim to be praising alchemy, but which, of course, includes some praise that's clearly directed at Elizabeth herself. So, for example, as Pallas did for wit, the tout of Greekish dames excel, so she, clearly Elizabeth, among European states for wisdom bears the bell. And then he goes on, it compares it to Pallas. I mean, this is pretty conventional imagery. We'd expect to find similar kinds of language in non-alchemical patronage suits as well. Does that mean then that the fact that she's a woman doesn't make much difference except in the choice of language? You describe her as Pallas rather than Mars, for example. Well, let's turn to the haberdasher Richard Walton, who wrote a patronage suit to the Queen, which he addresses to the most godly, virtuous and mighty princess, Elizabeth, by the grace of God, Queen of England, France and Ireland, defender of the faith. So, the conventional introduction. But on the first page of the treatise, he underscores the holiness of alchemy by giving a striking biblical example. Our Lord God himself, he says, of his great mercy did give it, i.e. the secrets of alchemy, to Moses. For I have found that Mary, the sister of Moses, made a book of the same science. And also I find by many men's writings alleged certain places of her book, naming Maria prima physica, the which was the sister of Moses. And therefore it, meaning alchemy again, must be called by good reason holy, that God himself hath bought. So of course Walton is here referring to the famous alchemical authority, Maria Prophetessa. And it's striking that he puts Mary at the start of his text rather than any of the male adepts whose work he then goes on to discuss in greater detail, frankly, than that of Mary. And my third and final example, William Bloomfield, a radical Protestant preacher who wrote a, quite frankly, extraordinary treatise addressed to Elizabeth, essentially petitioning for the return of his parish, which he probably lost by being a bit too radical a Puritan. Now, he hails Elizabeth using conventional language, but in the course of that praise, he adds some biblical examples, as did Abraham, David, and many other holy prophets seeking, or, as he proved, Queen Hester, Judith, and chaste Susanna, and many other prophets and prophetesses, kings and queens. So again, he's adapting his suit to invoke women parallels to the more conventional examples. However, I think he, with a shocking lack of tact, rather than simply presenting his case before the Queen, he goes on to add, to the Queen, and by the advice of your most honourable counsel. And he actually mentions it twice when he petitions the Queen. He kind of implies that her decisions will be monitored by her honourable counsel. Now, I don't think he would have added that if he'd been addressing a male patron, and I'm certainly sure that it would have done him no favours at all in Elizabeth's eyes, since she generally did not respond favourably to any implication that she was supervised in some manner by her, of course, entirely male Privy Council. So on that note, I'm going to end, just leaving us with the image of Elizabeth I as a woman patron of alchemy who did sponsor alchemical practices, who is for the most part addressed conventionally by her petitioners, but whose gender identity nonetheless did add some nuance to their approaches. I'm happy to talk more in Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. Next up is Matteo Martelli, who will be talking about female practitioners in Greco-Egyptian alchemy. Matteo?
Yeah, thank you, Jo, and thank you, Jenny, for opening this roundtable. I'm going to share my screen. Do you see it?
Yes, we see it very well.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Thank you again. So yeah, the title of my talk, my little talk, is "Female Practitioners in the Greco-Egyptian Alchemy," and the Greco-alchemical corpus, namely the anthology of Greek alchemical texts, mainly transmitted by Byzantine manuscripts, features the name of 5 women who distinguished themselves for practicing and writing about alchemy. They are the Queen Cleopatra, Maria the Jewish, Theosebia, and Tafnutie. Furthermore, we also have a treatise transmitted under the name of the Egyptian goddess Isis, who addressed her alchemical teaching to her son, Horus. Now, it is interesting to note that all these female practitioners can be chronologically located in the earlier phase of the ancient alchemical tradition, namely between the 1st and the 3rd, 4th century CE. Moreover, a quite interesting variety of nations, so to speak, are represented in this group. Maria is presented as a Jewish practitioner. Tafnutie is certainly Egyptian, and we should also include Isis in this group, even if we ignore the historical figures hidden behind this name, this mythological figure. And Theosebia, a wealthy, perhaps a Roman woman who lived in Egypt. The same names, actually, this is interesting, are already mentioned by Hermolaus Barbarus in his commentary on Dioscorides. In particular, today, I will focus my attention on 3 female figures, since ancient sources allow us to better investigate their mutual relationships and thus discuss the role played by women in the earliest phases of Western alchemy. As many of you already know, Maria featured prominently in the history of alchemy, from Greco-Roman antiquity to the early modern period. Called by many names throughout the centuries, the divine Maria, so Theia Maria in Greek, Maria the Copt in Arabic, Maria the Prophetess, Maria Prophetissa in the Latin tradition, actually Jenny was referring to it. She was also credited with different writings by Greek, Byzantine, Arabic, and Latin alchemical authors, who also attributed different technical innovations to her. Zosimus of Panopolis counted the woman among the Jews who openly wrote about the alchemical art. This information is also confirmed by the Byzantine historian Syncellus, who mentioned Maria along with Democritus, who was credited with 4 alchemical books in the alchemical tradition. We can read the passage by Syncellus. In Egypt, in the temple of Memphis, Democritus was initiated by Ostanis the Persian, who was sent by the Persian kings of the time to administer the temples in Egypt, along with other priests and philosophers, among whom there was also Maria, a wise Jewish, and Pamminis, and he wrote on gold, silver, precious stone, and purple. Likewise did also Maria. They, I mean Democritus and Maria, were praised by Ostanis for concealing the art with many clever riddles, and they condemned Pamminis, who wrote without envy. A similar passage is also included in an Arabic dialogue between Zosimus of Panopolis and her pupil Theosebia. We will see Theosebia later on. In this Musaf as-Suwar, the book of images, Zosimus specifies to follow the teaching of Democritus as his main master because before him, Ostanis already preferred Democritus over other practitioners. In fact, we read, Ostanis ordered each sage to write an illuminating but difficult and enigmatic book. Maria was also with them at the time. Then he told them that the best book that illuminated, revealed, and hid the true alchemical knowledge was Democritus, who had the crown. Here, Democritus seems to have has been preferred over Maria. However, we must note that both the authors, I mean Democritus and Maria, are largely quoted by Zosimus. In Zosimus' work, scholars have counted 76 references to or quotation of recipes from Maria and 74 quotations from Democritus. Sorry. In particular, in many writings, Zosimus cites a treatise on furnaces, or also it's also called a treatise on furnaces and instruments ascribed to Maria. Zosimus extensively used his work as a reference work for the description of different alchemical devices. Maria indeed would have been the inventor of a different alchemical instrument, such as an alembic called tribicus, namely a steel with 3 reception bases, and the kerotakis, an instrument where metallic leaves were exposed to the vapors of dyeing substances. Byzantine manuscript preserves illustrations of these pieces of equipment, as you can see in this slide. In particular, the drawing of a specific instrument, the so-called kerotakis, was interpreted by the French chemist Marcellin Berthelot, one of the first editors of the Greek alchemical corpus, as an early reference to the so-called Ben Marie, or Balneum Mariae in Latin, even though this technical term never occurs in Byzantine alchemical treatises. Actually, Balneum Mariae is quite common in the Latin tradition, of course, both in the late medieval and in the Renaissance, early modern treatises, but even in the Arabic tradition, the expression was found only in quite late treatises so far. I believe that it has already become clear from the sources quoted so far that Zosimus of Panopolis represents our main source for reconstructing Maria's alchemical work. On the other hand, Zosimus addressed most of his writings to another woman, namely Theosebia, who is presented as the sister of the alchemist in the Byzantine tradition, especially in Byzantine sources. This information is usually interpreted as referring to a very close group of practitioners to which both Zosimus and Theosebia belonged. In this group, the woman was not only a pupil of Zosimus, but she was also involved in teaching activities. This can be extracted from an interesting passage of Zosimus' Book of Tin, which is only preserved in Syriac translation. Here, Zosimus described the contents of a foundational book on Chemeia, namely Alchemy, which was believed to have been revealed by angels to women. And we read in the passage, this book contains the crafts of many thousands of words. Then those who came afterwards, with the intent of doing well, divided the book in many parts. I know this is not beyond your understanding, my lady, that means Theosebia, but you know it well, since you are one of those who would like to hide the heart if it had not been put in writing. For this reason, you formed an assembly and administered the oath to each other. You presented the parts of the book in a shorter form and you taught them openly. But you claim that this book cannot be possessed unless in secret. Now, even though secrets are necessary, it is quite fair that anyone has a book on alchemy, since it is not kept secret for them. Zosimus and Theosebia's group was not the only alchemical circle active in the Greco-Roman Egypt. In other passages, indeed, Zosimus blamed Theosebia because she temporarily joined the group led by the Egyptian priest Nilos or Nelos. This group was firstly criticized by Zosimus for not following the teaching of the ancient masters of alchemy, such as Democritus and Maria herself. Moreover, another woman was part of this circle. Zosimus indeed mentioned Tafnutie, which is clearly an Egyptian name, basically the Greek transcription of Tapa Necher, that means the woman of God. We read in Zosimus' chapter on the treatment of the body of magnesia. But you, blessed Theosebia, stop with these foolish elements troubling your understanding. For I have heard that you speak with the virgin Tafnutie as well as with some uneducated men, and that you put their foolish and useless tales into effect. Then we have a quite famous passage where basically Zosimus tells how Nelos, so the master of Tafnutie, in an experiment for whitening the body of magnesia, failed because he didn't follow the instructions the masters. And then Zosimus concludes, after hearing these facts, so the failure of Nilos, her opponents, from her opponents, Tafnutie was upset about Nilos' ridiculous actions. Unlike Tafnutie, Theosebia knew the foundational works of alchemy, and Zosimus also refers to a small library kept in a Theosebia household. In this collection, also Jewish alchemical books were included, among which we might safely count also the books of Maria the Jewish. As recently pointed out by Bing Hallum, Zosimus' Arabic tradition emphasized how Zosimus kept the legacy of Maria alive in order to transmit it to Theosebia. The Arabic book of the Keys of the Heart, ascribed to Zosimus, even presents Theosebia as the daughter of Maria the Jewish, basically Maria the Copt in the slide, according to the Arabic name of these figures. We can therefore wonder to what extent the key role played by the books of Maria in Zosimus, in the relationship between Zosimus and Theosebia, fostered the fortune of this figure in the later alchemical tradition and contributed to transform Maria into an iconic figure of ancient Greco-Egyptian alchemy. And thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you, Matteo. That was very interesting. We will now go to Ute Frietsch, who will be talking about the common iconography of the urinal, the alchemical vial, and the womb in the 16th century German woodcuts. Ute, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Jo, for inviting me. And so yeah, it's perhaps rather a search what I'm undertaking now. And I have to add a question mark in the beginning. Is there a common iconography of the urinal, the alchemical vial, and the womb in these woodcuts and in these German woodcuts? And I would like to start in reflecting on the title of our round table and to say that there is a relation between presence and absence. And absence is perhaps one of the preconditions for representation. And representation takes place on different levels, on the social, symbolic, and on the imaginary and iconographic level. And of course, my subject concerns the imaginary and iconographic level. So I start with two books. One is from Jodocus Willich, Urinarum, published in the first quarter of the 16th century, and then again with illustrations by Hieronymus Reusner in 1582. And this is one of these illustrations of a urinal. And it's very interesting that the illustration of urinals by Hieronymus Reusner is so similar to his illustrations of the alchemical vial in his Pandora. So Hieronymus Reusner, a Paracelsian physician, is the illustrator of this urinarum, and at the same time he is the author of the German version of the Donum Dei under the title Pandora, which was published in the same year in 1582. And so it's perhaps not so astonishing that the iconography of the urinal and the alchemical vessel looks somehow a bit similar. And also, for example, in our Wolfenbüttel copy of both books, there are colored figures of both of them. The alchemical vial is colored by readers, and the urinal is also colored by readers, because, of course, you have this loss in the beginning of the printed tradition, that you don't have the colors of the manuscript tradition anymore. And yeah, of course, you know this manuscript tradition of the Donum Dei, 15th century manuscript, and you have always this queen and king and other naked persons inside of the vessel. So I present them again together with the urinal. And what came as a surprise for me is this representation of a womb in Eucharius Röslin, the Pregnant Women and Midwives Rose Garden, first printed in 1513 with woodcuts by Erhard Schön. And for me, it was really surprising to see this representation of a womb turned, so to speak, upside down, the shape of an alchemical representation. Or this was my first impression, to interpret it like this, that it is turned down. And so here you have the fetus, and here you have the these alchemical figures, and perhaps you can even think on the homunculus as a concept. So, but from the point of the iconography, I found it surprising to see them together. And of course, this womb, because it's a transparent womb, looks a bit like glass also. And here are more illustrations from the same book, Twins. And here even a surfer on the way to birth, and more from then. Yeah, and of course, this is a representation of fetal lies in the womb. And I wondered if there is a common shape, a pattern of these illustrations, and where this common shape was used first. And of course, we know that in the Galenic tradition, we have a 2-chamber womb. And in the scholastic tradition, we have even a 7-chamber womb. But nonetheless, there are similar, so to speak, illustrations of fetal lies already in the 13th century, and perhaps already earlier. And in the 13th century, I found them in an Ashmolean manuscript, number 399, here. And of course, it's similar, or similar is a not so precise term. You have here these mouths. The mouth is a bit different from the Eucharius Röslin representation. And of course, it's transparent because you you shall see the fetus inside. And here another manuscript. This is from 15th century. It's a German manuscript also on fetal lice, and probably the direct model for Eucharius Roslin for his printed book. And of course, it looks again a bit different. So, and in 16th century, the representations of the womb were often already much more complex, like the manuscript by Leonardo da Vinci, which looks somehow cosmological, or is described often as a cosmological representation of the fetus. And then Andreas Vesalius, who represents the fetus and the womb in a also more complex way, even with a diagrammatic representation and with some explanations in the text, and the womb as organ with a lot of skins inside. So I come to my conclusion. Eucharius Roslin's figures go back to medieval manuscripts with different illustrations of fetal lice, and they were probably not used as patterns for alchemical vials in the tradition of the Donum Dei. But here again, my question mark. And the common pattern of the womb and the alchemical vial related to the analogy between generatio and creatio, or genesis, was often used in Paracelsian texts of the 16th century, but is perhaps not represented in these figures. So this is the result of my search, and I come perhaps to a rather negative answer to my own question.
Well, thank you, Ute. Next up is Carmen Schmechel, who will be talking about male and female minerals in Georgius Agricola, the Natura Fossilium, a matter of classification. Carmen, you have the floor.
Thank you, Jo, and thank you for the invitation. I'm delighted to join you here at the Turba. And hello, everyone on Zoom and on YouTube. I'm going to share my screen now. Okay, so I'm a historian of science and medicine, and I have a very general interest in theories of matter and in transformations of matter. And one of my more particular interests is about how early modern natural philosophers claimed that minerals and metals are produced, as they call it, in the bowels of the earth. And many of these authors claim that minerals form and grow as a result of the combination of a male and a female element or principle. And of course, this is a sweeping claim, and we can go into the details later in the Q&A. There are nuances to this. But many in doing this used a framework which is essentially an analogy with the animal and vegetable realm. I'm going to the next slide. So in this short presentation, I will focus on one particular work, De Natura Fossilium, published in 1546 and authored by German natural philosopher Georgius Agricola. And we will look at a few concrete examples of how Agricola codes certain properties as male or female in certain respects, such as color, brilliance, toughness or brittleness, or magnetic strength. Now let us begin with the latter and turn to the lodestone. I hope that you can see the whole picture here. Oh, sorry. Okay, the lodestone. So I won't read the whole quote because you have it here, but I will read the relevant part to our topic. So lodestone varies in color, this and that. Some will draw iron to itself with force and is called male, while some is weak and is known as female. So this is a matter of classification. I will not attempt any interpretation. I will just leave it here as it is. Now, our next case is a classification by color illustrated by Sapphire. So Agricola writes, there are two varieties of sapphire, one dark, the other light. The former is called masculine, the latter feminine. The feminine variety sometimes has so little color that it is almost like quartz, although it is always somewhat darker. The darker the sapphire, the greater its value. So the color was another line of criterion of classification along which the female and male coatings were placed. Now sard or carniolum, a classification by both brilliance and transparency. It may be redder than the cooked shell of a marine crab. The more brilliant stones are called masculine, the duller ones feminine. The masculine stones may be translucent, and the feminine stone is so dense and gross that one cannot see into it. And then we have another case, which is that of Stimnite. And here we have a classification by several categories: roughness, fragility, but also the brilliance of the mineral. So Stimnite, which is called Stimmi by the Greeks. The mineral is divided into male and female varieties. Pliny writes that the male Stimnite is harsher, rougher, more sandy, lighter in weight, and duller. The female variety is more brilliant, more fragile, and can be cleaved with ease. And we will see that in a certain respect, Stimnite constitutes an exception in that it is in fact the female variety that appears to be more prized. And here Agricola writes about what Dioscorides writes about Stimnite. At one time, Stimnite was sold as the native mineral, and Dioscorides regarded as the best that which was most brilliant, most easily cleaved, most fragile, and contained the least earth and foreign material. This was the variety Pliny called female. So this is my last slide, and at this point I will attempt one general remark, which is that clearly Agricola is presenting these designations of male and female as a kind of convention. He never says this stone is female or this other mineral is male. He always says this variety has been called female or male by such and such. And he relies on ancient writings for this kind of information. So my conclusion is that it is a method of classification, or perhaps rather categorization, that was transmitted throughout the ages because it was deemed convenient and because it helped with the recognition of minerals, their properties that could be inferred, and the practical uses that were assigned to the different varieties of a mineral. Now, just one element to where this may have come from. It is known that it was Theophrastus that most likely was the first one to write about this in his De Lapidibus, and he was a contemporary of Aristotle. Then some of those assignments were taken by Pliny, and then we have a very long and complicated medieval story where some of these elements mixed with the mercury-sulfur theory and also with the Aristotelian theory of dry and moist exhalations, and with the reworkings of that until we come to Agricola. And I think this is it. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you, Carmen. That actually helps me set up my discussion a little bit, and I will share the screen now. Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. I need to. How do I?
Can you see my slide or?
No, Oh, okay. I managed to stop the sharing, and now yours should be visible. Sorry.
Is it okay now? Is it visible? So. Okay. Okay, well, I will begin. First of all, I just have to say that this is a very tentative attempt as part of my my endeavor to understand substances or chemical substances in a cross-cultural context. And I will begin by saying that, well, 2 sessions ago, we had an illuminating presentation by Dagmar Vujastik on alchemy in India. And one of the questions that arose in the discussion was whether or not we could refer to the phenomenon of Rasa Shastra as alchemy. Arguments can be made either way, but at least from a distance, it somehow makes sense that Rasa Shastra, the discipline or knowledge of Mercury, should be seen as a form of alchemy in a broad sense. This is because when we think about alchemy, Mercury or quicksilver is one of the first substances that springs into our mind. It also somehow embodies alchemy as a domain that deals with material or semi-material substances that are ill-defined, strange, flowing, shiny, and mutable. Now, Mercury looks bizarre and behaves even more so. Even its origins is odd. Before it was quicksilver, it was more often than not cinnabar, a red mineral that looks nothing like mercury itself. Now, we also learned in the last session with Matteo Martelli and Lucia Maini and Mariana Marchini just how difficult it is to extract mercury from cinnabar. I'm just wondering who the person was that had the patience and the strength to grind cinnabar for hours in the hope that something might turn up. The emergence of mercury drops or pearls from cinnabar must have seemed something short of a miracle. For the offspring of cinnabar, of course, looks very different, looks shiny, silvery, liquid, and metallic. And it is not, of course, just its looks that are strange, but its behavior too, as it vanishes very easily if put in the fire, yet it does not simply disappear, but can be retrieved afterwards. So how do you classify a substance as strange as mercury? Sure, it looks like silver, but it's not silver. And one of its enduring names was argentum vivum, and from it, quicksilver. But another way to classify it, of course, is to use a sexual analogy, that is to think of it as a male or female. Now, of course, analogy is a shifty terrain, and there is no such thing as a perfect analogy. The subject becomes even more problematic when we deal with sexual matters. And if recent debates on sexuality and gender have taught us anything, is that it is, of course, very difficult to say what male and female is. But these debates are here and now, and we must wonder what happens if we look into the past at what the male and female category meant. Now, thinking about mercury in terms of a sexual analogy shows just how problematic it is to think of male and female in terms of a substance that is not sexually differentiated. And yet we are accustomed to think of mercury as being female. For instance, in the Bergbuchlein of circa 1500, there is a statement there according to which, quote, in the mingling or union of quicksilver and sulfur in ore, sulfur acts as the male seed and quicksilver acts as the female seed in the birth or conception of a child. This quote refers to something very specific, the theory of metallogenesis, as originating from the mixture of mercury and sulfur. This, as we all know, had Arabic roots and must have been drawn from the even more ancient knowledge that mercury and sulfur indeed combine to produce artificial cinnabar. We know that this theory drew on Aristotle's meteorology and its dry and moist exhalations, but of course there is no sexual analogy there. Now, that mercury would be female makes sense in terms of Aristotelian views of the female as cold and moist. though the notion of a female seed is more along the Galenic and medical tradition rather than the Aristotelian one. At the same time, I'm wondering if the analogy of mercury and sulfur combining together to produce cinnabar may have had a contribution to the emergence of the sexual metaphor. In this sense, I'm looking forward to the laboratory experiments Matteo and his team are undertaking on the production of artificial cinnabar to illuminate us whether the actual combination of mercury and sulfur might have had a role or not in the sexualization of the substances. I would add to this another important conjunction, that of gold with mercury in the process of amalgamation, that may have contributed to the sexual analogy, as gold in medieval astrology was associated with the male and the sun, and mercury, as we already saw, with silver, moon, and the female. The union of gold and mercury may have stood at the root of some of the alchemical images of the sun and the moon conjunction. And of course, you know this mainly from Rosarium Philosophorum and the Splendor Solis. Now, at this point, I want to complicate matters a bit and suggest that Mercury, which is usually seen as female, was also portrayed as the male god Mercury or Hermes. These, I may suspect, may be a Renaissance-related development related to the emblematic tradition, and the examples I'm offering date from the 17th century. If this is the case, then we may be dealing with a historical change in the way that Mercury was perceived by the alchemists. Moreover, I want to draw the attention to the fact that the female character of Mercury does not hold in the cross-cultural comparison. In the Indian alchemical traditions colored by tantric doctrines, Mercury is male, and its counterparts, usually mica, but also sulfur, is female. Indeed, in this perspective, Mercury is seen as the semen of the god Shiva, the creator of the universe. Sulfur, on the other hand, is seen as the menstrua of the goddess, usually Parvati, whom Shiva has intercourse with. The association of Mercury with maleness seems to be related with a visual resemblance between quicksilver and the sexual male fluid. But there are, of course, deeper associations here, for a Hindu mythological tale connects the male god with the moon and the moon with semen. The relationship between the moon, liquid, Mercury, and semen goes some way to explain the view of Mercury as male. But there is also a chemical aspect to it, because the interaction between mercury and sulfur, or mica, seems to be perceived as perfecting the male element. The sulfur essentially purifies mercury, which then becomes a superior philosophical form that is capable of transforming both metals into gold and humans into immortals. This philosophical Mercury is still male, though a superhuman, godlike male. Now, interestingly, if we look back into the medieval Western tradition, we can recall that at least one strand of alchemy imagined philosophical Mercury as a Christ-like figure, exalted yet still imagined in the male form. However, it can also be argued that the Christ-like philosophical Mercury can in fact be conceptualized as an androgyne, a being that has gone back to the pre-dual origins of gender. And as a concluding slide, I found this really cool image of what I think is a kind of philosophical Mercury from 1578 Czech version of the Rosarium Philosophorum, which seems to be a composite image of what philosophical Mercury might be like, maybe. Anyway, I will stop sharing now and we'll open the discussion at this point for basically starting to discuss all these different aspects of the female presence in alchemy. And of course, we we began by talking about real presence, historical presence of alchemy, maybe more shadier or more mythological presences. We went into iconography and finally into symbols and metaphor. And I'm just wondering whether someone would like to begin by asking the question of what connects these things. What is the female aspect in alchemy? Matteo, if you have a comment or would like to answer the question.
I have a question actually.
Okay.
Somehow related to what you were referring to, Jo. It is a very simple question linked to the female-male categories used to classify substances, mineral substances in particular, and also to your talk about mercury as a female or male agent, let's say. This is if you want, a silly question. To what extent do you think that the grammatical, aspect could have played a role in the way some ingredients were perceived and classified? Because sometimes I got the impression by reading at least the Greek text that authors were classifying a term, a substance as male or female because the grammatical, I mean, the name was female or masculine, say, feminine or masculine. Since we have in Greek, this is very clear for mercury and sulfur. Sulfur is masculine and mercury is feminine, for instance. We have E hydralgos and O theon. So I was wondering whether also grammar could have played a role, let's say, in building these categories. So this is my question and a kind of comment, let's say, on this point.
Well, I mean, obviously, yeah. I mean, when we deal with etymology, that's the big question: is where these masculine or feminine names come from. Obviously, I don't know the answer to that, but it seems like when people associate feminine or masculine pronoun, there is a certain sense of associating it with a female or male characteristic. But the question is, when did this start? And yeah, I mean, I don't have the answer for that, but it's an interesting aspect of this. I mean, I've been trying to look at some of these etymologies, and of course you stop at some point and you wonder how far back it goes. But of course we don't know. So.
I was curious, for instance, whether in Sanskrit Mercury is masculine or feminine. I don't know if Dagnar is still among us today. And
I can answer that. I was just thinking about that too. So Mercury is male, however, so is sulfur and so is mica. So they're all male by grammar.
Male. Okay.
So I'm afraid we can't go down that route to explain the gender differences.
Does Sanskrit have any neutral, by the way, any neutral way?
Yes, so mica can also be a neutral. So we have it either as a masculine or as a neutral.
That's also interesting. I mean, of course, some languages don't have the neutral, and some do. And of course, when you have the neutral, you must wonder why they didn't actually use the neutral for minerals or metals. Why did they feel like they have to use a gendered pronoun? I think Ute had her hand up.
Yeah, thank you. My question goes to Matteo, and it's about these female protagonists. And I wondered if they were perhaps introduced to undermine Aristotelian hylomorphism, if this could be an aim of natural philosophy against this Aristotelian model of Hyle and Morphe, the male Morphe and the female Hyle, substance and form. And if these female protagonists were perhaps introduced to disturb this Aristotelian model.
Well, thank you. To be honest, I never thought about this possible interpretation. The reception of the Aristotelian models in the earliest phases of alchemy is quite debated, even if I think that Zosimus probably knew Aristotle and seems to refer to his work. But I don't have in mind any passage where, for instance, Maria or Theosebia were presented as figures that didn't agree, let's say, with the Aristotelian view on the female and male roles in generation. So I don't know. I should maybe look again at some passages with this perspective in mind. At the moment, it's maybe an open question.
Hey, Jenny wanted to comment or answer my first question.
It's only because you asked us a question, and I thought someone should make an attempt to answer. You asked what is the what's the connected tissue, what actually draws all these things together. And if I may be forgiven an answer that might sound a bit pedantic, what draws it all together is that we've been put together in a round table. In other words, we shouldn't forget the agency of ourselves, our scholars, in attempting to put these things together. So, what does, the fact that women were practicing alchemy in the early 17th century, what does that have to do with the gender status of Mercury? Well, of course, the answer is that in this gathering, we're interested in the female presence in alchemy, and because that presence has often been understated in scholarship, if not neglected entirely. I think scholars are very keen to find evidence that there is something happening. So, that's, as I say, it's a silly answer to the question, but it's nonetheless a sign that the scholarship is currently engaged in looking for the presence of women and other groups who haven't traditionally been well represented. I had a comment as well on the Agricola, so Carmen's insightful presentation on Agricola's use of gendered stones, and I mean this looks to me like something that comes out of observations of the animal kingdom, because it's very common. I mean, just think of birds, for instance, where the male of the species will typically have much more brightly coloured and lavish plumage than the female. So I wonder if we need to look much further than simply an attempt to categorize minerals in the same way that animals are categorized based on these sometimes very clear distinctions in appearance between genders. And it's just a thought. Thank you.
I mean, I don't actually have an answer. Thank you, Jenny, for this great suggestion. I think I don't know that. I'm not aware of work done on especially this issue, comparing how metals are described and minerals are described with how birds, for example, are described. But I think that would be very interesting indeed. I'm pretty sure, though, that the writers were aware that they're transferring analogies, and that it's a convenient way of talking about the mineral realm, for which about which it was more complicated to talk, since it was a non-living realm, and there were fundamental differences. For example, the fact how metals grow, and the fact that they are more what Aristotle would have called homoeomerous bodies, as opposed to any kind of plant or animal that has distinct body parts and all that. And so that meant that they grew in a different way, and they behaved in a different way as chunks of matter. And I think there was a need to transfer analogies from other kingdoms, like the animal kingdom, because that was the only way to begin to talk about it, I guess. But yeah, thank you.
Dagmar has a question. Dagmar?
Yeah, actually, more a comment, I guess, or maybe a question as in, did I understand this right? I was thinking of Carmen's presentation about materials. My impression was that the feminine materials were always less good than the male ones, slightly lower quality, needed to be, you'd have to change them to make them a bit better, improve them and so on. Is my impression wrong or right? Because otherwise I would see this slight subordinate nature maybe of the feminine as perhaps a connecting factor in sort of feminine presences in various alchemies that we were looking at. Would you agree?
Oh, thank you, Dagmar, for the question. It wasn't universal. There were some exceptions to the rule, and one of them, the one exception that I found was the last slide that I showed you with a female Stimnite, exactly. And so one thing that can be said is that there were such cases where the female version was the more desirable one. But yes, most other instances are as you say. Now, why this is so, I don't know. that I think requires much more research in more branches than just the history of minerals. But I would definitely look at some of the Aristotelians, some of Aristotle's writings about embryology, about generation, and the way in which Aristotle in particular was reworked throughout the Middle Ages.
If I may intercede here just briefly, I mean, for me it was a bit strange to hear that, I mean, often the brighter minerals were female and the darker were male. I mean, you would think the opposite, but then again, I was thinking that Mercury also is shinier. And I don't know if there is a meaning to this, because usually you think of the brighter stuff as being, like the sun is kind of brighter, right? And it's male. So I don't know what the meaning of it is. I mean, why they would think this way. I don't know.
It might have been also some sort of a convergence of maybe an initial attempt at making meaning, and then just the transmission of it as a convention. I guess people just got attached to a certain kind of description, and then it was easier just to perpetuate what the ancients knew.
Yes, of course, but I mean, the question is, what is at the root of it? I mean, why would you say that something darker would be male? Is it because, I don't know, I mean, I don't know, I'm just wondering whether it's, I mean, I understand the color, the more colorful thing to be male. I mean, linked to what Jenny was also saying about the male also being more colorful sometimes, but darker, it seems like a more negative, in a way, negative aspect. And when you think of the sun and the moon, of course has less light than the sun. So I don't know. I'm just riffing here on the possibilities.
Maybe a chemist could help us and tell us whether the feature of color isn't somehow correlated with other features of the minerals, such as the hardness or brittleness or something. Are darker minerals maybe more resistant?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I can see a lot of hands up, so I will ask Amy to ask her question or comment.
My comment is for Matteo. I'm very interested in Maria, of course, and her longevity, throughout the alchemical tradition. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about why Zosimus put so many important precepts in her, accredited to her. A lot of people say, oh, well, it's just she's fictional, it doesn't really matter. But he connects her, especially to vessels. Which, as we know, are often womb-like. So what are your thoughts about why he gave those important precepts to a woman?
Thank you for the question. I think this is one of the key questions that is difficult to answer at the moment, at least for me. And the impression that I got is that there is, if you want, a friction between different traditions that are linked to different nations. Let's say we have the Egyptian tradition that is local, basically, because it's the tradition where of the land where alchemy basically was born. And we have the Persian tradition that is linked to Democritus, and we have the Jewish tradition that is mainly linked to Maria at the time, more than to Moses, that also Moses plays a role. And my impression is that Zosimus is following a kind of mixture between the Persian Greek tradition and the Jewish tradition, and is trying somehow to contrast this with the local Egyptian tradition. And since Zosimus then became such an important figure in the history of alchemy, also is teaching, so that the role played by Maria in his known work was received somehow and perpetuated. So I think a possible answer should lie in this kind of rivalry between different traditions. And I was also wondering the role of Jews in the Greco-Roman Egypt, especially between the 1st and the 4th century. We know that there were very important Jewish communities, especially in Alexandria, but I didn't explore yet the possible relationship between this historical fact and the earliest alchemical authors. So this may be a direction for further researching, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I can't help intercede again. Sorry. I'm just wondering, Matteo, if there is any link at all to the biblical story of the sons of God that come and teach the females, the Enochian tradition of teaching females. Conjuncting with females and teaching them.
I think so, actually, yeah. And it's interesting that the passage that I read where Theosebia is presented as a teacher is straight after actually the passage in which Zosimus basically gives the account of these fallen angels that were teaching different crafts, and especially alchemy, to women. So I think there is a connection. And even in the treatise by Isis that I just briefly mentioned in my presentation, there is a version of this story. And then that version is particularly interesting because we have a Jewish, say, myth or tradition that is reported in a text ascribed to an Egyptian goddess. So it's a very syncretic example in that case. So, but I think that there is actually a connection between the Enochian tradition and the role of women in this phase.
Thank you. Stephen had a question or a comment. Please, Stephen.
Yeah, I have a question for Matteo as well. And it is about this order of initiation, which is described by Synkelos. I've been doing a little bit of work on John Dee's annotations to one of these anthologies of Byzantine Greek authorities, and he seems very concerned to establish an order of initiation, establishing what Peter Forshaw recently suggested we should call a Prisca Chimiologia. And so he's keen to establish not Peter Forshaw, he's keen to establish the order in which these authorities should be placed. And I was judging by your paper, he would have been able to find out enough information from the Zosimus texts in that anthology. Or what made me start wondering was whether the Synkellos was known in Western Europe in the 15th or 16th century. Would that have been a source which he could have possibly used, or would the Zosimus books in themselves been enough for him to start to establish a working order of initiation?
Thank you for the question. I'm not very familiar with the reception of Synkellos in the Renaissance and in the early modern period. So this would be a very interesting point to be checked, I think, because I know that there are several works on let's say, the chronology in general and chronography and ancient chronographers in the Renaissance. So maybe Synkellos was used, if I well remember, also to reconstruct Eusebius' lost chronicle. And this might be, let's say, a link, I think, because in the work of Zosimus, what is left in the Greek tradition, so what basically the Renaissance scholars could read, there is nothing really clear about these initiations. Especially the other passage that I quoted is from an Arabic version of Zosimus that I don't think that was known in the early modern period. So I guess that Synkellos could be the key, actually. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. I shall check that.
So next up is John Christie with a question or comment. John?
It's a thought, really. I suppose a comment. I was wondering how to pursue the question of gender, and in particular gendered substances. Starting out with Matteo's grammatical point. I mean, for instance, excuse me, do we have anything like a linguistic census across, say, the ancient cultures of all their words for all minerals? Yeah? Don't you, doesn't one need a sort of archive like that to really start working on it? And looking at the naming, looking at the gendering. What happens as you start, okay, gendering is retained and inflected, more modern languages. What happens when you get to, well, English, which doesn't retain that kind of inflection? But nonetheless, do the substances somehow still retain their gender, say in 17th century English? Yeah, I think there's a lot of really quite complex questions raised by this aspect of what you've discussed. I'm just trying to think of ways to go forward with it. I'm afraid they sound rather laborious though, but thank you.
Yes, I mean, it's. I think it would be great to do that. I'm actually not. Yeah, I mean, it would be nice to understand the genders in Sanskrit. We learned in Greek as well, but basically a database of references and how you connect them. I mean, how do you even know that a word in Greek corresponds to, I mean, basically that's the same mineral corresponds to the one in Latin. So I don't know. I mean, sometimes it seems like there is ambiguity there. But yeah, I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts about that.
By the way, I checked, and sulfur is neuter in Greek as well. It's totseion. There is no masculine form. At least I couldn't find it in the alchemical corpus. I misremember. So it's just another point to this, let's say, grammatical discussion.
But hydrargyrum is masculine?
No,
or
it's
feminine?
feminine. No. Mercury, hydrargyros is feminine.
Right. But it's because of silver, it's feminine. I mean,
Actually,
it comes from...
Argyros is masculine.
Really? So basically, when you transfer, you put the the watery part in front of it, it becomes feminine.
Yeah, maybe.
I don't know. I'm just saying.
It's an interesting interpretation, reading of. If you make something liquid, it becomes.
Well, I mean, yeah, because it's obviously that's in Aristotle. I mean, you can, and I'm assuming that sometimes Aristotle is just following tradition. I mean, he's not necessarily making things up himself, you know. And but it's hard to know like where he's being original and where he's actually not. Being. Just following what the Greeks were doing beforehand. So, Alexander Angerhofer has
thank you very much.
Comments, please.
So actually my question goes back to Ute's contribution with the iconography of the womb and the alchemical vessel. And what immediately came to my mind was Anna Zieglerin, who considered herself or her womb as an alchemical vessel. Do you think that she got that from the Paracelsian corpus or maybe from the medical manuscripts that were around at the time?
Yeah, from the Paracelsian text, this is plausible because she even modified the Paracelsian homunculus recipe. And so she knew the tradition. And so this is very plausible.
Okay, thank you.
Dagmar has another point or question. Dagmar?
So I was also thinking about Ute's presentation and the question of gendered substances, how they come together in the Sanskrit tradition. And so as Jo was saying, sulfur and mercury have to be mixed, sulfur being female and mercury male in the Indian tradition. One of the ways they can be mixed is that the mercury is actually inserted into an actual woman's womb or into her vagina. The Sanskrit word used is yoni, which can be either the vagina or also include the womb. And so the reason being that the menstrual or procreative substance within the woman is considered to be a kind of sulfur. So there were sort of practices which describe this sort of insertion of the mercury, and then the product that is formed through this insertion that then comes out again is retrieved, has been purified, has been processed, has been cooked in the womb. So we have this sort of idea of a woman's body, the womb, the actual womb of the woman's body being the alchemical vessel, and in other procedures you have an actual vessel, right? So we have these sort of parallel practices described. So that's just something where, the sulfur of the woman, that sort of explains the gender of the sulfur, and the use of the womb sort of relates to the idea of the woman being the vessel. Sorry, it's not a question. It's just
but it's actually quite interesting. It's and also, I mean, I've been thinking a lot about what these. I mean, why why sulfur would be female and I mean, I don't really have the answer, but it seems to me like it's also related to the maybe to the climate. I mean, at least that's what Gordon White was suggesting somehow, that basically the liquid, I mean, the mercury, the liquid part, like this is kind of a positive aspect, while in maybe in the, Europe, maybe it was a bit less positive and they appreciated the sun more. But I don't know, this is a separate discussion that I don't want to get into with 4 minutes to go. Jenny, you had a comment or question.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I dropped it in the chat, but it's really just to go back to this relationship between the womb and the flask, which is absolutely explicit in Latin medieval alchemy. I mean, the flask is routinely described as a womb. So the word matrix is even used sometimes to describe both the vessel itself and sometimes the matter in which another matter is being asserted. So if you're looking for gendered language of substances, I mean, 14th century alchemy is the place to be, especially if you look, for instance, into the Pseudo-Aurelian corpus, a work like Testamentum, which is continually playing with this, the different genders of substance. So it asks, well, what happens if, the woman becomes hotter than the man because you've somehow changed the substance in a way, and then it thinks, do you then need a stronger male substance, or what actually happens? So my sense is that this is something that alchemical philosophers themselves were very engaged in and played with. A problem perhaps is that many of the texts in which they discuss it haven't really been edited yet.
I'm actually wondering, how early can we, is it kind of a late medieval trope to discuss? It seems like there is all these images of, kind of the sun and the moon and all that kind of thing that appear. Of course, the whole imagery of alchemy is kind of a later medieval aspect. But
well, the sun and moon is Arabic, so that's very early. I'll defer to Matteo's expertise on whether we find any of this imagery in the earliest sources in the Greek.
I was thinking about some possible passages. I don't remember explicit comparison between the womb and the vessel or the alchemical vessel unless we do have something, for instance, in the way in which they describe the alembic, and especially the upper part, but otherwise I don't remember explicit comparison. I know that in Arabic I'm sure there are plenty of comparison like this, and but in the Greek tradition, at least, is not so common, I guess.
That would be my sense too, that we find it in the Arabic tradition, it's further developed in the Latin.
I'm just wondering, in the Arabic tradition, the sun and the moon conjunction are also, obviously it's definitely in the Emerald Tablet and this kind of traditions. But what I've been having trouble with is whether these actually can be the same as mercury and sulfur, or are they different? This is somehow, sometimes when I look at an image, it's not very clear to me whether they're trying to describe mercury and sulfur, or I don't know, something else like gold and mercury or something else. But yeah, that's somehow my question. It's something that I'm trying to figure out. Kim, I will take one last question, and maybe there will be other opportunities to discuss this further. So,
okay, so can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello. Okay, so just a thought, maybe, or rather a question. Maybe there are associations with other practices or traditions. I don't know if if they're already established at that time, but other than the sun and the moon, maybe we can consider Jupiter and Saturn, with Saturn being associated as the feminine side and Jupiter as a masculine side, as with as in Kabbalah or other practices. Maybe the gendered substances are associated with that, or I don't know, I'm not sure.
Well, I mean, I think there is definitely a connection between, I mean, obviously the sun is usually seen as, I mean, we are now talking about the Western tradition as being male, and the planets are associated with the gods and all that kind of thing, and that's of course projected onto minerals and metals. But like for instance, of course Dagmar knows more about this, but for instance in Indian tradition, I mean, you have sometimes the sun is sometimes male, and sometimes it seems like it's more like a female. Yeah, I mean, Dagmar knows more about this. But, yeah. So it's not a constant. I mean, I guess my point in all this is to show that the characteristics, the gender characteristics, are not constant, and they're not. I mean, they seem to change across cultures, and there are certain assumptions that appear about what female and what male is, but they seem to vary across cultures and across historical periods even. Yeah, that somehow my overarching question is whether we can see the female as being something constant or not. And it seems to me the answer is not. I mean, it's sometimes a liquid form can be seen as female because, well, something in Aristotle, or there are different aspects to it. But then sometimes again, the liquid can be female or can be male because of the association with semen, or the male, the male semen. So that's somehow my what I could find so far. And it's interesting also in the Chinese tradition. I've been looking a little bit, and it gets even messier than that. I mean, it's basically basically the female contains the male aspect, and the male contains the female aspect. So it gets even more complicated. Ute, you have a final remark?
Yeah, I also think so, that it's not stable, and it's the hermaphrodite which is introduced perhaps to represent this messiness, or this changing positions between both sides. So then you have the hermaphrodite, and it's especially Mercury, which is considered as hermaphrodite. And then it's clear that it's not, it does not have to be stable or to be considered as stable.
Yeah, I mean, of course, there is this, the issue of Mercury being philosophical Mercury, I mean, being purified in some way. I mean, it seems to me that the hermaphrodite aspect is more about the purified form of Mercury rather than the original. So it's somehow the transformation is through some kind of chemical operation that combines the opposites, right? And somehow this kind of hermaphrodite emerges. But then, of course, the question, and this is somehow something that I was talking with Leah Devon as well, who was briefly here. We were talking about this. I mean, the hermaphrodite as being, I mean, is it kind of transcending the gender? Is it also kind of going back to the root of it all? I mean, for instance, if you look at Chinese traditions, they postulate this kind of anterior unified form, like kind of an androgyne that divides into the two aspects, to the female and the female, the male and the female aspects. So it's kind of either going back to the root or progressing towards a new state of matter where it transcends the gender.
Yeah, I think it's perhaps a symbol for the end of the natural reproduction and of the beginning of the artificial reproduction.
Yeah, that's an interesting point as well. I mean, where it's yeah, I mean the levels of natural and artificial are also very important in this discussion of yeah, I mean, and of course, I mean the alchemical, is it natural or unnatural? That's always the question that is being asked, right? It's whether what they do in the laboratory somehow alters the natural world improves the natural world, or it just creates something very artificial. But yeah, I mean, this is a very interesting discussion, but I feel like I'm going over time because of this is a very fascinating subject. But yeah, I mean, if there are any kind of last remarks, I mean, I hope to continue this discussion because it's so fascinating. I mean, one thing that I hope came out of this discussion is that well, the female aspect is important. That there were female practitioners, perhaps in fact that they were, let's say, at the root of alchemy. There are also this kind of myths of the female that is receiving knowledge or passing knowledge, and it's in other traditions as well. I mean, as far as I found, it's also in the Chinese tradition that it's there is some kind of god that shares with the female, but there is also a tradition where the female goddess transmits to the male. So it's I mean, all these aspects should be taken into account and maybe understood better in terms of what alchemy is. I mean, let's not forget that there are some aspects of, I mean, there were sometimes they were talking about alchemia itself as being female. I mean, they were personifying it as a female, which is another question, is why they would do that. Is it also linked with the etymology of chemia, or I don't know? It's another question to think about. But certainly this etymology, I think it's very important as well to if we can grasp what it means. And but thank you everyone for coming. I hope you'll join me and everyone next year as well. This is the last one for this year. Trying to put together a program for next year, and I'm welcoming any suggestions you might have in the next period as I'm putting this together. And what else, except that I hope the end of the year will be pleasant for all of you. And maybe with less COVID, if it's possible. Just be careful and enjoy the advocat or whatever the tradition is, and mulled wine and glühwein and glögg and all those wonderful drinks of Christmas. And I hope you have a great new year. So yeah, goodbye everyone. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Goodbye, Joe. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you,
Matteo.
everyone. Thanks.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you. Merry Christmas.